Shocking. That's how the Prime Minister described the RCMP video entered as evidence by the defense in the case against Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation Chief Allan Adam. We're going to show you some of that video now. A warning, it's graphic and violent. Officers had stopped Adam for an expired license plate. As you can see, as you just saw in that tape, one Wood Buffalo RCMP officer approached the group while a second officer arrives and tackles Chief Adam down to the ground. Chief Adam is now facing charges of resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer. His lawyer entered the video into the public court file as part of a motion seeking to have those charges stayed. The RCMP had already reviewed the video, calling the officer's reaction reasonable. Alberta's police watchdog agency is now investigating.
I think everyone who's seen this video has serious questions about what exactly happened, about how it happened this way, and about that use of force that we saw. That's why we're calling for an independent, transparent investigation that will get the answers that so many questions people are asking right now.
And we will hear from Chief Adam's lawyer in just a moment. But first, we also just heard last hour from Deputy Commissioner Curtis Zablocki, commanding officer of the Alberta RCMP. Earlier this week, he said systemic racism does not exist in policing. A comment, he said he didn't believe that, a comment that was countered by the Prime Minister. Today, he said it's clear that systemic racism does exist in the RCMP. For more on that, I'm joined by the CBC's Rafi Boudjikanian, who was just at that press conference. Hi, Rafi. Thanks for being with us. Tell us a bit more about the change in tone and in position of the Deputy Commissioner.
Yeah, I mean, it's been quite a week for the RCMP here in Alberta. So he came out with those comments on Monday saying systemic racism does not exist in Canadian policing. He got a lot of negative feedback about that. And of course, yesterday, the video came out that you were just talking about. Then this morning, Alberta's Criminal Trial Lawyer Association, which represents around 240 criminal defense lawyers in this province, comes out and says Deputy Commissioner Curtis Zablocki needs to resign or be fired if he will not resign. And the officers in that video need to resign or be fired. And the officers who looked at that video and said use of force was justified also need to go. So then this afternoon, we suddenly hear that Deputy Commissioner Zablocki will have something to say. And he has said that he spent the week consulting with community leaders, with Indigenous leaders, and hearing them out. And he at some point even said that he had to Google terms like structural inequality and terms such as unconscious bias. And he's come to the conclusion that systemic racism does exist. Now, he says that this change has nothing to do with the video or the lawyers. We'll hear a little bit more from him now.
Since making these statements, I've had conversations with community and Indigenous leaders who are members of my own Commanding Officers Indigenous Advisory Committee, heard from employees of the RCMP, and spoken with colleagues and other police chiefs. Much of that conversation has centered on racism, how it's defined, and what it means to those affected. These have been conversations that have challenged my perceptions and made it clear that systemic racism does exist in the RCMP.
Rafi, what more can you tell us about the investigation into the RCMP's actions in that video that we just saw involving Chief Allan Adam's arrest?
So one thing to keep in mind is Alberta's police watchdog agency, ACERT, says it can't comment on active investigations. So we're at this weird point where we haven't really been told exactly what it is about the officers ACERT is looking into. Traditionally, ACERT gets involved when there is a shooting, by a police officer or an officer-involved shooting. There's no shooting in this situation. ACERT just says it's looking into the conduct of the officers. Now, interestingly, today's news conference was initially advertised to reporters as the RCMP responding to ACERT's investigation, as well as Curtis Zablocki's earlier comments this week. Once we showed up here, though, Zablocki said that he couldn't address the ACERT investigation because it's all sensitive and before the courts, etc., etc. He did say, though, that the RCMP just couldn't release the dashcam video because it was part of court evidence, or due to be part of court evidence. And I'll remind you, the RCMP, of course, has said this video shows use of force was justified. So we were curious about, well, in that case, why can't you release it publicly? Well, their answer is they couldn't because their hands were tied up by the court system, Bashi.
All right. Thanks for the update, Rafi. Really appreciate it. The CBC's Rafi Boudjikanian in Edmonton. Jumping off of Rafi's reporting, I also want to bring you an update on the Commissioner of the RCMP, Brenda Lucki. During a series of interviews earlier this week, including with my colleague Rosemary Barton, she said that she could not systematically define or specifically define systemic racism that she had heard. She told Rosemary 15 to 20 different definitions, and that she would not come out and say that it did exist in the RCMP. She released a statement not too long ago, just within the last hour. It hit our inboxes, and I want to read you a portion of it. During some recent interviews, she wrote, "I shared that I struggled with the definition of systemic racism while trying to highlight the great work done by the overwhelming majority of our employees. I did acknowledge that we, like others, have racism in our organization, but I did not say definitively that systemic racism exists in the RCMP. I should have." She goes on to say, "We now have the opportunity to lead positive change on this critical issue. It is time to double down on these efforts. There is so much more to do." We will continue to track that statement and any reaction to it. But in the meantime, I do want to bring in Alberta AFN Regional Chief Marlene Poitras for some more reaction. Hi, Chief. Nice to see you. Thank you very much for making time for us.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for having me, Vashi.
I wanted to ask you for your reaction to the statement I just read from the RCMP's commissioner, but also the deputy commissioner in Alberta, who a few days ago has said he didn't believe systemic racism existed in policing in the RCMP in Alberta, and he has very much reversed course today. What is your reaction to that?
Well, our people, First Nations people, have always known that systemic racism existed. They've experienced it all their lives, and they continue to experience it, obviously, with the Chief Adam, the incident with Chief Adam. And so it's we've known that, and I'm glad that they're admitting there is systemic racism, because it gives us the opportunity to move forward and address it.
When you talk about moving forward and addressing it, I do want to ask you for your thoughts on that. But first, on that video that so many people in this country have watched over the last 24 hours or so of Chief Allan Adam, what was your reaction when you watched that video?
I was horrified. I was angry. I was hurt. It should never have happened. The amount of violence that occurred and the escalation of it shouldn't have happened. I believe that the RCMP had many opportunities to de-escalate the situation, but they didn't take that opportunity.
The Prime Minister said today that it's not an isolated incident. Would you agree?
Absolutely. You just need to talk to any First Nations people, person anywhere, and they can tell you about the experiences that they've had with the brutality of the RCMP and the police, and it is systemic.
So now that we see both the commissioner and the deputy commissioner acknowledge that racism is systemic in the RCMP, and we point the conversation towards rectifying that and to changing it, what sorts of things do you want us to be talking about?
Well, I think we have to follow the lead of the Minneapolis police, who are disbanding their force. We need to tear down the system and rebuild and build in accountability mechanisms to the community that is being served. And of course, we need to have our leadership at the table. They have to be involved in terms of how the policing will occur from here on moving forward.
So am I right in interpreting what you just said as sort of a defunding of the police? Like you want to see the RCMP dismantled?
Well, they need to look at their system. They need to review the racism that exists and figure out ways, and whether it's reallocation of funds or how, looking at mental health services and being more of a working with the community to address the issues in a real way. If you just have to look at the incarceration rates of Indigenous people in this country, and I would be interested in knowing what charges that they're there for. Like probably a lot of misdemeanors, and they shouldn't even be incarcerated. So yeah, they need to look at the whole system, the RCMP as well as the law enforcement system and the laws in this country.
Do you think that reform can happen from within? And I just want to read you the last part of the statement from Commissioner Lucky, in which she says, as an institution that is committed to modernization, the RCMP is committed to listening and respecting the lived experience of others and continuing to learn from these conversations. This is when real change will happen. Do you think that the reform that you're talking about can occur from within?
I believe that it's a start, but then of course we need to have a table, be at the table where we're talking about substantial reform to eliminate systemic racism, eliminate it totally from the whole system, and that's the only way that we're going to achieve reconciliation and healing in this country.
Do you? This is a sort of part of what that reform might look like, and it was especially part of the conversation this week because of the availability of this video and of other videos as well that show some of these actions. The idea of body cams, equipping the RCMP with them. The Prime Minister says it should happen. The RCMP says now they're going to do that. I know obviously there's a whole host of other reforms that you're just discussing that are really important. Do you think this is part of that? Do you think it would help?
I think it would help, but I know that in some instances, from what I've read, that police would turn off their cameras and when situations are escalating or when they're involved, and I think that there needs to be stringent laws around that so that they will not be able to do that. And I think that will help, but that's only one part of the solution.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Chief Poitras. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
AFN Regional Chief Marlene Poitras. The release of that video of Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation Chief Allan Adam, as we mentioned earlier, happened in full last night. Brian Beresh is Chief Adam's lawyer. He joins us from Edmonton. Hi, Mr. Beresh. Good to see you again. Thanks for making time for us.
Thank you.
I want to start off and actually just ask about the well-being of your client. How is Chief Adam as this video becomes so incredibly public?
He's been fairly traumatized by this event. He does not want to speak publicly about it. Frankly, he would prefer to be leading his community and dealing with COVID and other issues, and not this.
Why did you and him as well, but why did you both think it was important that the full video be available for the public to see?
Well, because so often there's a disagreement between what was observed by individuals and what was recorded. The video tells the story.
What do you make of, we were just listening to the Deputy Commissioner in Alberta, who a few days ago had said that he did not believe there was systemic racism in policing in Alberta, now says that based on the conversations he's had, he realized that there is systemic racism in policing. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm very disheartened by it. He strikes me as being somebody who's close to 60 years of age. If it took him the last week to realize this. It's quite disheartening. Anybody who's worked in this province, as I have, for several decades, knows it exists. So I'm not heartened by his recent revelation. I would be more heartened by a suspension of the officers involved, an investigation by a group independent of ACERT. I would be more impressed with action, not words.
You, I'm sure, heard so many questions to the Prime Minister about this video, and most of them centered around the idea that it becomes very difficult to understand how, upon watching it from start to finish, the RCMP could have so conclusively determined already that there was no excessive force being used. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think it leads any reasonable observer to believe that this is a cover-up, that no one reasonably observed it, because had they would have hauled the officers in, they would have suspended them, and they likely would have charged them with assaulting a citizen.
You said you weren't happy with, or you would like a more independent investigation than ACERT can provide. Why is that? ACERT is, to my knowledge at least, supposed to be that independent body, rather, in Alberta that does investigate matters of policing.
Well, the problem is that ACERT is not properly funded. We've had cases where it has taken them 12 months for a report. That's not acceptable. And finally, we need some body independent of the police. We need a civilian oversight. Let's have it. Let's have it federally.
So you
see no problem with that. Let's do it. We don't need former police officers. My clients are very suspicious of those investigations. Let's start opening the books like we do with judges. Independent body.
Have there been any conversations with the federal government about the possibility of that?
We have proposed that on numerous occasions, generally as a criminal defense group, but that has not occurred.
Do you think that this could change that conversation?
Well, I hope so. I think this Prime Minister is sensitive to our concerns, and they're not our concerns, by the way. They're concerns about our clients. We are the voice for our clients. Without us, these cases would not be detected. These cases would not be investigated. It is time for action. We've seen inaction over the past decades that is simply intolerable, and I don't think the citizens will support it.
Help me understand where things stand, I guess, legally or in the court process. Charges were laid, right, by the RCMP against your client, who say, I should say for our audience,
as the police normally do when they abuse people or take advantage of them. The best defense is a good offense. You lay charges. Now the accused has to defend himself or herself.
And the argument that they have put forth is that your client, Chief Adam, resisted arrest. And, you can see at the beginning of the video, obviously he was, I don't know if the right term is resist, he didn't want to be arrested. He accused the RCMP of a bias towards him, and he was swearing at them. Still, when you see the charge at him, it takes, as a human, you just react, and it takes you very much by surprise.
Well, look. My client was contesting a $310 ticket. He had just received his vehicle back from the police, who said there was no problem. He did not believe the ticket in itself would be justifiable. He questioned that, and the problem is, when an Indigenous man questions a white police officer, there is a power imbalance. His pursuit of that justified everything he did. He took a defensive stand, and the RCMP, as opposed to trying to distill matters, quiet things down, took offensive conduct with the tackler who came in from the sidelines who knew nothing about the case. The RCMP, if they think this is reasonable, the public will not stand for it. There has to be a reinvestigation of this entire case from an outside force.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Beresh. Appreciate your time very much, as always.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.